You are now live.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome to the December 9th, 2020 meeting of the East Lansing Planning Commission. This is a special meeting specifically pertaining to effectively a work session regarding the form-based code, the Shaping the Avenue code. Mr. Haywood, would you please call roll?
Bowman.
Here or present, attending remotely from East Lansing.
Thank you. Boyle. You're on mute, Kathy.
Muted. All right. Present, attending remotely from East Lansing.
Thank you. Cahill. Kusler.
Present and attending remotely from East Lansing.
Thank you. Lapine. Sullivan.
Present and attending remotely from East Lansing.
Wagner.
Present, attending remotely from East Lansing.
And Williams.
Hello, fellow commissioners. I am present and attending remotely from East Lansing.
And Wolf.
Here, attending remotely from East Lansing.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. You had a copy of the agenda in the packet that was distributed to us. I would entertain a motion to approve that agenda.
Wolf, so moved.
Williams, support.
Then moved by Commissioner Wolf and seconded by Commissioner Williams to approve the agenda. Is there any discussion on that motion? Seeing none, we'll call for a vote, and let's have a voice vote here. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 And those opposed? That motion carries. And I'm recalling that once again, I am to remind us that we are dealing with new technology here, and thank everyone in advance for their patience. Let all members of the public know, any who happen to be in attendance, that they will have a chance to address the commission during public comment, which actually follows our discussion this evening. Each commission member will be called on individually to speak during each item. A commission member may pass if they do not have a comment for that item. Commission members are reminded to state their name before speaking, making a motion, etc., and that all votes of consequence will be taken by a roll call vote. I will note that Commissioner Cahill has joined us, and that rounds us out to 8 out of 9 of us and allow us to proceed with the business at hand. That being review of parts 5 and 6 of the Shaping the Avenue, that dated November 17th, 2020. And I believe that we left off at, or we finished at the end of part 4 after our last meeting. I'm paging down here. So we should be starting on, at least on the copy I've got, the document itself, page 32, or of the larger packet document, I have page 43 of 75. And that's that hiding at the top is part 5, street and public realm standards. So let everybody get on the same literal page. So in this case, we're moving forward from, we're breaking away from individual buildings and their impact on the streetscape, and actually talking specifically about the street and the public realm. There are a couple of references in this to the non-motorized transportation plan, and basically the intent, as I think I've mentioned in the past, is that we're trying to encourage the use of the individual private buildings to support and to create a comfortable street space. And actually there's a really terrific graphic. Oops, it's actually a couple pages out. Excuse me. I was thinking it was the next page. There's a terrific graphic that illustrates what is meant by all those, the terms that are going to be used in reviewing the street and public realm standards. But ultimately, as I say, the intention is that the buildings themselves are going to try to establish a strong, well-defined edge for the public to use. Questions on page 43? And I'll refer to just the larger document if everybody's comfortable with that. Okay. Page 44 gets into questions of street connectivity, essentially saying that that the individual streets are not to result in dead ends or cul-de-sacs unless they're relatively short, and then that new streets would follow the regulating plan. There are just a few, but there are some new streets indicated as potential for being built in the regulating plan, and the section here on new streets covers how those might be implemented if that time comes. And then on page 45, it carries on with existing streets and saying that those would ultimately aim to support the pedestrian transit-oriented development of the master plan and the avenue and this avenue form district. One of the things that the avenue form code is going to implement over a great deal of time is the introduction of alleys where they don't currently exist. Again, keeping in mind that the form-based code is trying to encourage pedestrian dominance at the front of the lots. It's trying to move as much vehicular traffic, motorized vehicular traffic to the backs of the lots. And so that access to garages and access to back of the lots would be made, as it's done in several places throughout the city now, via streets, or excuse me, via alleys that supplement activity in the street. So you can see on page 45, it specifically states some of the conditions that would be used to implement these alleys, with the idea that over time, if there's not an alley currently in place, that over time, the backs of these lots would be, I'll say, reserved for the creation of alleys over time. And then that gets us down into the graphic I was referring to just a moment ago, referring to street types. It's actually on the next page. And it talks about, here you can see all the, I think a much clearer indication of what the different terms that are being introduced in the avenue form or the form-based code. We've talked initially about required building lines and right-of-way lines, but here we see that the dooryard is created by the space between those two lines. Just outside of the right-of-way line, we'd find a clear sidewalk, then the street lawn, and then of course the travel lanes in the street proper. And you can see through that cross section how the different components would ultimately interact with one another. And then the table below, the required widths for each of those different components. I'm not seeing a lot of questions, so if there are none, I'll just continue to move forward. Some specifics about bus stops, including some of the features that would be included in the sort of the ideal bus stop in terms of location and size. And then the street space standards. These have to do, this is the space that actually, let's see if you, it doesn't actually say that, excuse me. But the street space standards start to cover things like size of the street trees, or excuse me, the size of the tree lawn and what would typically be planted there, the size of the different individual planting beds. And then moving on to page 49, street space elements and materials. Typically things like benches or garbage cans or recycling cans and that sort of thing that are included, what we typically see in some of the areas that are the more dense areas in the city right now, street furniture and so on. And moving on to page 50, talks about plazas and civic greens. The general difference is that plazas are active pedestrian centers, and so we're going to see that those might more likely than not would be more heavily paved than the greens, where the greens sort of by definition are greener and would have a lot more, or would have much more planted area than the plazas would. And again, just some specifics about locations and layouts and some of the design ratios that we would expect to see in those elements. And then finally, on page 51, item 508. Sorry, Commissioner Wolf, I'm quite happy to stop talking. I just didn't see any hands until just now out the corner of my eye. Please.
Yeah, and just a very minor thing on the page you just talked about, the text takes a jump over to the right. It gets indented for some reason, starting with item D
Sure does.
compared to the previous pages. And very minor.
Yep. I was thinking that maybe that was sort of a left-right thing, but it doesn't look like that's the case.
I'm wondering if maybe there was a graphic on the left side at one point, or, but anyway.
Thanks. Then on to page 51, where it refers to the tree lists, and this would be the list of the trees that we would typically see sort of pre-approved for planting in the tree space. Mr. Haywood?
That looks like Cahill has a question.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Cahill. I can see you. I just didn't see your hand. And you're on mute, Jack. Jack, you're muted.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Dan, I was just wondering, I'm following along and I had printed this out. But the page numbers, I'm following everything fine, but the page numbers you're using are different than what I have.
Yeah.
Do I have the wrong copy of?
No, you don't. I presume if you're looking at the page that has tree lists, your page would say 40, I presume.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I can refer to those pages if that would be the preference. And maybe it sounds like if you're working off the printed copy, then that would be preferred. I'm referring to the sort of the larger document that had some preliminary information in it. So it sort of shifts the pages all back by 10. So going forward, I'll refer to the page numbers in the Avenue Form District ordinance itself rather than the larger document. And just so to avoid any confusion, maybe for the first couple of pages, I'll refer to both. Maybe that'll make things more confusing. Anyway, that brings us to the end of that section and moves us into probably the most, the section where we had the most input. And I suspect it's probably likely to generate, at least from my colleagues, the most amount of discussion. That being the architectural standards. One of the things that I think is encouraging about this particular section, and this is page 41 of the ordinance or 52 of the overall document. That right out front, it says that the most architectural standards apply only where clearly visible from the street space. And you can see that this is on page 41, item 602A. And those are in our lowercase, or excuse me, our uppercase, but smaller script, which of course we know refers specifically to a definition, in this case found on page 62. And it's pretty clearly laid out that these measures are only going to apply, or excuse me, more often than not will apply if an element is within 40 feet from a required building line or a street space. So if it's located beyond that point, the regulations that are outlined by the ordinance would not apply. And I think it's actually important in this particular case because in the historic district, there's often some question about whether or not alleys are considered public space. And so if you can't see and in much of the historic district work that occurs outside of view from the public realm isn't governed by the Historic District Commission. And so generally speaking, if the work occurs on the back elevation of a house or a building, the Historic District Commission doesn't actually weigh in on the work. But then again, the question then comes, is it something, well, if it's on a corner lot or if it's one off of a corner lot and you could sort of see it, if you squint and bend down and get on your tiptoes or whatever, ultimately, where does that regulation apply? So in this case, I think it's important that it clearly states it's that the standards apply only where clearly visible from the street space, and that is defined as within 40 feet of the building, the required building line. Commissioner Boyle, Vice Chair Boyle.
Yeah, I did have a question about that because there are some of our downtown alleys in the area that the form-based code is going to apply that are relatively heavily trafficked by pedestrians. For example, the Center City development, the alley between the Landmark and the other buildings is pretty heavily trafficked for pedestrians. And the front of the parking structure is nicely finished. And the back of the parking structure is ugly as I've ever seen anything with no thought. And I don't know. I mean, I can understand we don't want to require people to put expensive finishes on the backs of their buildings, but some of our alleys downtown are heavily used public spaces.
Absolutely are. You raise a good point. It's ultimately the question is that, you know, does that change is there any intention to change the definition of clearly visible from the street space to include particular alleys or particular backs of, you know, in particular zones and so on? Any thoughts or any, Commissioner Cahill?
Yeah, I have a question because I don't have a definition for street space in the copy I'm looking at.
Page 62. It's actually the definition is it's quote clearly visible from the street space unquote, right? It's a really it's starts with clearly, so maybe checking the C's.
Okay, I was where it said street trees and
Fair enough. Yep.
street wall. Sorry.
No worries. You see it now?
What page?
62.
Oh, okay. It's the whole phrase.
That's exactly.
Okay. I see. Sorry about that.
No worries. You're probably are going to get asked that question now by somebody else. You'll be able to move them along too. All right. So that being the case, there's an exemption for historic district properties, and then some specifics about, you know, sort of if there's sort of minimum standards on the materials, but by all means, if somebody wanted to do something that's slightly better, that would be, that idea would be entertained. And then we get into the specifics. There's for 5 different broader categories, starting with building walls. And I'll just leave it to you if you've not checked the sort of the purpose and intent. This is going to be our, you know, the primary point of impact, the building walls with the public realm. Commissioner Wolf.
Yeah, looking at what Jack just asked about, the document does in a number of places use the term street space all by itself, and it is in small caps. So we really should have a separate definition of that term, it seems to me. You know, it's quite logical for him to go look it up under street space. And
Sure. Oh, I was actually thinking that there was one, but just wasn't covering what I'm looking now. And indeed, I don't see one either because there isn't one. Ms. Schmidt or Mr. I saw Darcy's hand up first.
Yes, I think at some point we took that out because of the graphic that shows the entire street space.
yeah, I see that it is in an earlier draft that I have here.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like a useful definition to me.
Should we add it back?
Yeah, I don't quite remember the discussion when we got rid of it, but at the moment it seems like it makes sense to add it back.
Vice Chair, thank you. And then Commissioner Cahill.
Yeah,
Well-
there are, let me see. seven, I think, 7 terms that appear in small caps that don't have definitions currently in our list of definitions, and street space is one of them. And I'll send a list on to staff. I don't have to read them off to you right now, but I'll send
Thank
a
you.
list on to staff so you have them. Some of them, I think we all know what the definition is, but since in the beginning of the document, we say, if it's in small caps, you'll find a definition, we probably ought to put definition in there.
Mr. Hayward, did you have a response to that? And then yes, I've got you, Commissioner Cahill.
Yeah, thank you. And this goes back to Commissioner Boyle's comment, I think, in the prior meeting about that same issue. And so I took the time to go through the whole document and look for all of those definitions, since it's in a format that we can't search them. So I found them all. There are 27 separate terms that are used and shown as a definable term, but not defined. And some of them are used extensively, like street space, I think, is used 30 times in the document. So I hope I found all of them, and I have forwarded that to Darcy. So I think in our next redo of the draft, that'll be changed, but now with the exception that street space will stay, but add a definition. So
Perfect.
we should be set on finding all of those terms. So the next time you roll it out, we'll look for them again.
Great. Thank you. Commissioner Cahill.
I would just suggest if we add that back in, that at the end of it, we have a see also clearly visible from
Fair
the
enough.
street space.
Yep. Commissioner Wolf.
Getting back to the original question that Vice Chair Boyle brought up about the alleys, I tend to agree to some extent. I would really like to see our alleys, in particular the one that runs parallel to Grand River, be beautified a little bit. It is tough to decide how much we should require the building owners, how much money, to put into the facades there. If we were to decide that, I was trying to think about how we would do it in the code. One possibility, I don't know if this isn't very elegant, but would be to somehow, we might need a new designation on the, what is the zoning map called now? The
Regulating plan.
the regulating plan, yes. For an alley or two that would be treated differently. Or my first thought was we could put it into the definition of visible from the street space, but somehow put that alley specifically in there as an exception, but I'm not sure it's good to put it in a definition. So you can see I'm just thinking out loud here.
Well, it's much like the way that the storefronts have an additional layer of, right? So that they're in the mixed use frontages, but then it has a special, sort of darker color line for those areas that are going to be storefront. So maybe it's the same sort of thing. It's just does that alley have a name? The Albert Street Alley? No? All right. No? Okay. That alley, we all know which one it is. Vice Chair?
Well, and also, we've decorated some of our alleys. So to just not have any standards for the alleys in this area, or at least the ones that are frequently used by pedestrian traffic, and they wouldn't necessarily have to have the same standards as the street, perhaps. But do we want to have at least some requirements? Otherwise, there aren't any, right?
That's
There'd
correct.
be nothing, yeah. As long as it passes the building code, it would.
Yes. Commissioner Sullivan?
Yeah, I'm wondering if it might be a good option to break down the definition of alleyway into like major and minor alleyways using a distinguisher such as like the overall width of the alley. I don't know. It's kind of a can of worms, just a thought.
All right, it's a fair idea. I mean, we've got major streets. Any other thoughts? All right, then. It'll move us into again, the sections specifically regarding the different architectural standards. Item 603, which is on page 42, pertaining to building walls. I mean, again, it's sort of, I think most of these are covered, I think, pretty effectively. And when they talk about the purpose and intent, basically saying that the wall should express the construction techniques and structural constraints of the building materials, and that simple configurations and solid craftsmanship are preferred. I don't know if that maybe this point you can see it again on page 43, it starts to talk about the primary facade materials, much like we see in the current East Village code. And then some specifics about configurations and techniques that, as I say, it might very well be that these are areas where we're going to perhaps receive some comment or pushback or objection. And so it's sort of, I will tell you, as I suspect most of you have heard us, the three of Commissioner Williams, Commissioner Wolf, and myself have said throughout this process is that we dialed back significantly on this section of the code from its very beginning. And so I think we're comfortable, given that that was actually put before the Planning Commission, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago or so, when we did our initial review on this, was that it seemed to be that there was overwhelming support for some sort of architectural standards. And I feel like we've gotten it to the point now where it's not supporting or encouraging or requiring or demanding any particular style, but it's basically, it does expect that a certain degree of better materials will be expected, and that they be applied in, I don't know, I guess in the ways that you see that are laid out here. I'll be happy to take questions or comments. Commissioner Wolf?
And just because we're looking at this particular page right now, I would comment that this list of materials on this page is lengthier than what we allow in the East Village Code. And it's also lengthier than the list that was in the original draft of the Shaping the Avenue District.
And if I may, that actually goes back to, I think we touched on it briefly at the work session, that I think the initial text, in fact, it shows up in Ms. Schmidt's memo, that I think the initial, well, you know what, I've got it right here in front of me. Whether I'll be able to put my finger on it immediately or not remains to be seen. Yes, actually, it's in the overview includes a statement that, no, I don't have it. The intention when it was when the consultants wrote the code with the idea that it was going to reflect what I believe they referred to as the best traditions of Midwest or East Lansing architecture, and it was our general feeling that that was a bit too restrictive, and that, as Commissioner Wolf has said, the list of materials was expanded. And I'm not sure, but it's possible that we actually moved some that would have just been used as secondary facade materials, so sort of just as sort of elements of decoration as opposed to primary building materials. And so they maybe got shifted up a column so as to provide at least a little bit more opportunity for some more creativity in terms of what the facades would look like. So again, not being able to find the specifics, I think the intention was that we were trying to cast the net a little bit wider and encourage, if somebody wanted something that looked a bit more modern, fine. If somebody wanted something that looked a little more traditional, fine. That we could find a way to live with those ideas. And having said that, it seems that the objections that I've heard so far have to do with, we're getting beyond the idea of just establishing a form-based code, a code based specifically on building form. And now we're starting to get into architectural, well, that's the name of the section, but starting to get into architectural standards. And so if what we're really doing here is a code that's got a lot of the form-based elements to it, but it also has a good deal of, I think, a appropriate amount of architectural standards as well. And then that'll move us on to item 2, roofs and parapets. Again, I'll leave you to take a look at the purpose and intent. Commissioner Cahill, we're on page 44.
Yeah, Dan, I had a question on stucco.
Yep.
Which then says cementitious finish.
Mm-hmm.
I've never heard cementitious before.
Cementitious, yep. So
That is, I looked in the dictionary to see if it was in there.
Yep.
Is that something in the construction industry that everyone understands, or?
Yes, I'd say that, sort of stucco, and I'm actually trying to recall if, yeah, so this is actually, I think this is accounting for the idea that the stucco or some sort of dry vit type material, what we often refer to as EIFS, exterior insulation and finish surface. That's probably not the right word, but so it's sort of, if it's not specifically stucco that is made with cement, that is to say cementitious, it's going to be something that replicates that appearance to as great a degree as possible. System, that's external insulation and finish system. So yes, I would say that cementitious finish is probably something that building trades would be comfortable with. Is it in the dictionary?
Not in mine. It's not a real large dictionary, but it wasn't there.
Commissioner Wolf?
I notice now that under item C, the primary facade materials list, number 4 says stucco and then says cement plaster in parentheses. But when we get to section E that we were just talking about, it says stucco cementitious finish. I wonder if maybe those two, whichever term we wish we should use in both places. I assume those are not trying to specify different things, right?
I wouldn't think so, no. Commissioner Sullivan?
There is a definition for cementitious, and I think it's just a way to broaden the overall definition to be more of a catch-all. But it said the definition is of the nature of cement, so essentially including cement as a building material.
Cement-like, cementy. All right, will that move us on the next? Yep, Ms. Schmidt.
Are we going to change it to
Might as well decide.
which one? Yeah, let's.
No, I haven't heard anybody express any concern about the use of the word cement plaster. And since the cement is in there, I think
Great.
you don't have to worry about whether or not cementitious is ever used. Commissioner Wolf?
Yeah, I'm not sure any of us know the building materials well enough to choose between them.
Yep.
To me, either one seems as though it would be okay, but let's use just one of them.
Sure. All right, thank you all. That again will move us back to page 4, or on to page 44, roofs and parapets. So this is sort of the, as you know, a roof sort of crowns the building, and we often refer to it in the architectural terms of sort of it's a punctuation. Sort of it generally takes a slightly different form, even if it's just minor, or just a change in material, or just a change in orientation of masonry or something like that. And you can see some examples below. In some cases they stick out, some cases they don't. And then, on again, the next page, the next page with materials and configurations. Questions? Commissioner Cahill.
I'm wondering, with regard to materials, a lot of people are now having the, solar panels.
Sure.
I guess that's permitted below. It's just not maybe included in materials.
That's correct. I was going to say, I'm quite certain it came up. I see it now. It's under, as you said, it's under item D2.
It's a separate element from the roof itself that's allowed to be mounted on the roof. So that's why it's not a material.
Okay. I wonder if those might become the roof really in the future.
It's certainly possible. I think that Dow has been trying to develop a solar shingle for some time now. I don't know that they're actually in use yet or widely in use. All right, any other concerns? All right, then that'll move us on to 605 on page 46, street walls. And just as a reminder, these are the elements that are going to continue at the required building line. The building itself, of course, is going to take up a certain percentage of the width of the lot at the required building line, and all those areas that don't include building will be taken up with these street walls. So it's not necessarily, strictly speaking of, sort of a simple picket fence necessarily. In fact, it's not a picket fence at all. It's a wall, and it gets into specifics on what the materials and the opacity of those of that element on the next page, page 47. Questions? It should probably be noted, or maybe it's presumed or known by everyone, that the examples that are shown in the illustrations don't necessarily reflect the best examples that we might have offered in terms of they don't necessarily apply to the regulations that we've called for in terms of potentially in terms of height or in terms of what I refer to as opacity, sort of being able to see through particular portions of the wall. But I think that they do provide a good illustration of how we sort of pick up the edge of the building and run it. We run a wall along at that required building line so as to establish that strong front edge of the building all along the width of the entire lot. All right. Moving on to item 606, windows and doors. This is on page, is that 48? Yes, 48. Again, the purpose and intent, I think, describes pretty accurately what the sort of the aim of these different requirements are. And this, again, the next page covers materials and configurations and techniques. I seem to recall, it didn't take several meetings, but I seem to recall this particular area, we removed a great deal of, if you go back and take a look at the original draft, we removed a great deal of material from this particular section. There was, at one point, there was a requirement that all the windows had to have a vertical orientation as opposed to a horizontal orientation, right? So they had to be taller than they were wide rather than wider than they are tall. And that's been stricken. And again, we would typically see that orientation in traditional windows and not so much in more contemporary windows. And so we removed, I feel like we removed a great deal from this particular section. Questions?
No question, but the shutter size requirement.
Yep.
That is a particular interest of my husband, who hates to see shutters that are not appropriately sized for the windows they're affixed to.
Yep, it's one of those things. They do provide a nice little splash of color, but, and I think that was one of those things, right? If you don't really want to have them, in effect, if they don't look like they might be operable, then maybe find a different way to zazz up the elevation. That it's one of the places where I've worked in South Carolina. Indeed, the shutters were generally operable, so there wouldn't be much point in making them thinner than half the width of the window because they wouldn't cover the window when you wanted to actually use them. So, yeah, and I think that we wouldn't typically find exterior shutters on more contemporary buildings anyway. And so that
Right.
it's absolutely okay to omit them. But if you want to put them in, then there's sort of a rule of thumb as to how wide they should be. All right, and then on to lighting and mechanical equipment standards. Again, purpose and intent outlines what the purpose and intent of these standards are, and then they're relatively short. Basically, sort of stuff should be obscured when possible, and there's some specifics about street light and street light placement in regard to the planting of trees, street trees. I have a feeling that probably the most, although there weren't many questions from this group, it's my sense that that section 6 or part 6 is likely to garner a fair amount of discussion as we start to roll this out, but I guess we'll see. Moving on to part 7. Oh, sorry, Commissioner Cahill.
I like the idea of the, excuse me, mechanical equipment not being visible. So if you're putting that up on the roof, you're going to have to build an extra facade.
Right, the parapet.
On that, is that going to be included in the height limits?
I'll have to go back and check the standards on that, but I believe that. Well, let's see. If you go back, if you take a look on page 19 of the ordinance, that's pertaining to the height. The way I'm reading this now, and I'll have to ask Commissioner Wolf and Commissioner Williams to weigh in, that my sense looking at the graphic here is that the maximum story height, which is indicated by the small letter A, doesn't include the parapet. And so that the parapet would be built specifically to, well, in this case, the case that Commissioner Cahill's talking about, not only does it cap the roof of the building, cap the top of the building, but it would also be in place to specifically to screen your mechanical equipment.
Yes, that's the way I see it.
Commissioner Williams?
I agree, and that's what I recall our discussion being as well.
Keep in mind, Commissioner Cahill, that if staying on that same page, that again, page 19, that attic story, that's sort of, there's an opportunity for somebody that's building a property, or building, to gain a little bit of extra space underneath or above the maximum story height, which essentially, I would call that the eave height, but let's just use the term here, the maximum story height, and that you're actually permitted to build, if you wanted to build a pitched roof on top of that, above the maximum story height, you could actually get a little bit of extra space beneath that sloped roof that doesn't actually count against the building height, doesn't count toward the building height, depending on how you want to read it. So there's actually additional livable space that could be added above that maximum story height, whether it's for mechanical equipment or for, I don't know, storage or potential an additional small apartment maybe.
Should we make it clear that that's how you should read it?
Oh, it's I mean, the way I read it is clear, and it seems to me, and again, I'm going to have to go back to Commissioner Williams, Commissioner Wolf, that there actually, I think that the definition of attic story might even be included in the list of definitions, or that it specifically refers to that condition, if not immediate. Again, looking below here, I don't see it immediately, but that my recollection is that it's pretty clearly called out. Can't tell you exactly where, but within the document.
There's a definition.
Okay, there we go.
Okay.
There's a definition on page 61
Thanks. Commissioner Wolf,
of attic story.
thanks.
Yeah, I think the attic story is covered pretty clearly. I do wonder about the parapet wall, however, if it would be better to clarify that somehow, or
Ms. Schmidt,
We can take a look at that. I believe we thought it was clarified, but we'll take a look at that because we do have language in our current zoning ordinance that clarifies it. So we could use that language, but we'll take a look at that and see where we could add that to make it perfectly clear.
Well, anyway, I'm wholly in favor of not being able to see mechanical equipment. I hate seeing that on the top of a building.
sure. Getting back to my page here. Oh, I think that was the end then. That's page 51, and that ends the architectural standards. So strictly speaking, it's only five broader topics. And I think that I see Mr. Haywood just a sec. 5 broader topics, and I think that, as I say, I think we've pared it down so that I don't feel like it's overly restrictive. Mr. Haywood?
Thanks. So section 607, this is page 51, C, lighting. It uses the term street lights, another one of those that shows it as a defined word, but it's not defined. And that street light shall conform with section 50-155, which is just our general on-site, private property site lighting. But it seems like this section is talking about also a broader category of street lighting. So I think we're missing either an opportunity to clarify, street or lighting, site lighting, as opposed to street lights, how we kind of understand them as a utility. I think we probably need to beef that up a little bit to make that distinction and point people in the right direction. If they're, as part of their project, installing actual street lights as we know them in the public right of way, then they have to meet this standard and they can go there. If they're doing site lighting, then they have to go here. I think we need to clarify that.
So just so that I understand that better, you're saying that there actually shouldn't be referring to street lights and section 5155 because street lights are something that the city would install, and section 5155 are what the client or the owner would install?
Correct.
Okay. Ms. Schmidt?
I believe we call that just lighting in general. And so basically we could just change that street light shall conform to section 50-155. It should just say lighting shall conform because it also talks about building lights. I think that's the change that needs to be made. Does that make sense?
I think that gets us closer, yeah.
Yep. Commissioner Wolf?
yeah, I just looked this up in the original draft from 2 years ago. And at that time, section D, lighting was section D rather than C. It had 9 items under it. And there are all sorts of things about lighting on the property, like temporary holiday lighting is exempt from these regulations. HID or fluorescent lights shall not be used on the exterior, and so forth and so on. And I think those are the ones you're saying are covered in our other lighting section, right? So yeah, I think what you're saying would do it. If you take the word street lights and just change it to, what was it, lighting, I guess, or? So what was in there, we decided was completely duplicative or perhaps even contradictory to our existing standards. And that's why we removed all those additional points.
Yeah, the only other thing I think we probably need to look at is the example images that we use on page 50 clearly show a street light. So we just probably need to kind of rethink that a little bit and either clearly separate the two and say, you know, if you are installing, you know, improving the streetway and installing street lights, there's a standard for that, and here's the reference. And if you're doing other on-site lighting, then the reference is 5155. We can kind of take a stab at that.
Thank you. Good points all around. And if we're ready to move off of architectural standards, that'll bring us into part 7, parking and loading standards, everyone's favorite. I think we'd mentioned this at the last meeting, that you can see the first item under 702, that within the Avenue Form District, there shall be no minimum parking requirements, but that the applicant will include a, I guess, well, they call it an analysis that indicates why a particular number of off-street or off, I don't know, parking structure spaces would be required or would be necessary for the project. And it goes into some specifics about, oh, Commissioner Wolf, please.
Do we have any kind of standards or guidance for applicants as to what constitutes a parking analysis? Is it up to each one? Could someone just submit one paragraph depending on what their property and their analysis was, or?
That's a good question. I don't know that we have any, we definitely don't have anything clear here for a parking analysis. What in the past it's been more open. You know, currently we have a similar situation, and they just have to provide us enough information, and staff basically lets them know if it's enough information. I think it's going to be a little bit different for everyone because they're providing justification why they don't need the parking. It could be because of the type of use. It could be because they've got parking other areas that is sufficient enough to be used nearby in the parking system. So it varies. So we don't really have guidelines other than tell us why you think you're not going to need the parking. Most developments, but we know that's not always the case, but most developments, developers either believe they have enough parking or their project's not going to work. And then they have to provide the justification, and then you as the planning commission and the city council decide if their justification makes sense. So we don't really have a guideline is the short answer.
So it seems that this is one part of the code that's a little bit ambiguous. It departs from the idea that if they meet the requirements written in here, they know their project will be approved. This one has a little more judgment going into it, I guess. And I'm not saying there's anything we can do about that, but.
All right. And there's note at the bottom of this page, and then I think at the top of the next page regarding connected parking, again, with the idea that trying to encourage, I don't know, I guess the buildings to work together or to try to keep, if somebody were to park in one area and have to move down a couple of blocks or just the next lot over and wanted to move their car, the intention of this idea called connected parking is that there would be a connector lane so that you wouldn't have to leave one parking lot, go into the alley and or into the street in order to get to the next parking lot that's just immediately adjacent or perhaps a couple of buildings down. All right. We're actually beyond, I was just checking to see if we were going to try to tackle building use standards tonight. And apparently we weren't even going to try to get into parking. So if that caught any of you flat-footed, we could take a look at it again the next time we meet. Those two onerous pages. But this brings us to part 8. I saw your hand, Commissioner Cahill, just a sec, which does get into some a little bit more specific information. Commissioner Cahill?
Thinking about that connected parking and wondering how that would work, where you might have parking in the lot next to you set up quite differently than it would be in your lot. And you might be building next to an existing lot that isn't really suitable for connecting. How does it work then?
I don't know. I would submit that that's probably something that's going to have to be taken into account when laying out, as you say, your parking. That is that, typically we're going to find that the drive lanes are going to be about 20 feet wide, and that the parking spaces themselves are about 20 feet wide. That's effectively, if it's not universal, it's nearly universal. I think your question is probably, if my drive lanes are running east-west and the neighbor's drive lanes are running north-south, now what do we do?
Right.
Do I have to give up a couple of my parking spaces in order to accommodate his perpendicular drive lanes?
Or if you're building next to an already existing parking lot,
Right.
does the other person have to connect to you?
Ms. Schmidt, thank you.
I think the intent is to make sure the easements are in place. So in the future, if property is redeveloped, that there'll be a place to connect in the future. Because we know this is going to be all mainly redevelopment area that we're placing this code. So I think it's just to make sure that easements are in place to be able to do that in the future. It's pretty known that it's not going to always work out because of existing development. So.
Commissioner Wolf?
And there is an exception at the top of page 53. I don't know if you saw that, but any parking lots existing, essentially at the time this code goes into effect, would be exempt. So it would only apply to lots that were built afterwards. That should help a little bit. It would still be possible to put one in that might, in the further future, not be compatible with the next lot over, but
Why do we want that? What are we trying to accomplish with that?
Ms. Schmidt?
We want to eliminate people having to pull off onto the main road just to get into another parking lot. So if there can be some internal circulation, that can happen.
I mean, I think in an ideal world, it would be something where that would all be coordinated, much like, I'm just thinking of I don't know the number of the lot, but the lot at the southwest corner of Bailey and Albert. Right, that actually, it services all the properties on the 500 block of Grand River.
Right.
But it's, of course, it's owned by it's owned or managed by the city. But that, you could imagine that what would happen if the properties that front Grand River and that the parking lot that runs back to Albert, if those were all divided up into separate lots, how much more difficult it might be to try to, get the best use of that parking space, right? By coordinating everybody's effort. Is it something where we might actually gain a couple of spaces?
Okay.
Commissioner Sullivan?
I was thinking it would really help on the east end of downtown too, kind of as that redevelops. I know we talked about all the stacking issues that the Starbucks has there. So there could be cars getting in and out a little bit
That's
easier.
far east. Yep, exactly. Good point. All right. Again, that brings us into the use standards. Is everybody comfortable with proceeding with this? I mean, this is the place where typically we would, in our sort of traditional zoning, we would talk more about use than about form. And of course, in this case, it's just the opposite of that. We're talking more about form, with the idea that the uses within the building are going to be a little bit more, I'll say, relaxed. this was one we went over a number of times. And if you turn the page to page 55, you can see that this is the use table for the uses permitted in the mixed use frontages. And you can see that it's divided by the 4 different M1, M2, M3, and M4, and then further broken down, much like the comprehensive plan is, into uses that are appropriate for the ground story and uses that are appropriate for the upper floors. The key for this particular table is shown at the bottom. So if it's a shaded in square, if it's a black square, it's permitted. If it's a not shaded square, if it's a white square, it's a special use a special use will apply. And if there's no square in it, then that means that that use is not permitted in that particular frontage. Just by way of reference, those areas that have the special use permit required, the special use permit or reference to that special use is made over in the far right column. So say, for instance, take a look at the very top use, 1 or 2 family uses. We see multiple family class A. That particular use would be permitted in a ground story in the M4 frontage. My print is really small here, so I'm going to have to blow it up a touch. But those regulations are found in the next pages, section 803B2, section 803B5, and section 803G. So where you see the white squares, there's going to be a corresponding additional regulation on the far right column that's going to pertain to that use in that particular frontage. And as as I said, we went through this a couple of different times, added some different uses. Of course, you can see there's a whole raft of marijuana related uses that I don't think was probably part of this when we started initially. But you can see that these have been coordinated with those uses that had shown up in the comprehensive plan. If you recall, the comprehensive plan specifically identified uses and identified whether or not ground story or upper story was most appropriate for those uses. It's a lot to take in. And again, if you hadn't, I certainly wouldn't blame you if you hadn't taken the time to go over this before this meeting. It's certainly a lot to digest in a couple of minutes, but if we start with the idea that give you a better idea about what's expected or what the intention of the table is here, it'll give you something to mull over when you do get an opportunity to review it. Commissioner Wolf?
I'm just noticing that I think we are missing some of our current accessory uses. And I can't remember if that was intentional or, for example, things that might be in a multiple family use, like a fitness room or that type of thing, which of course came up with 300 West Grand. Another example I remember being in our current code is in our office uses, we allow them to have a food service, like a cafeteria intended for employees, which is why it would be an accessory rather than a primary use. Or I'm wondering, do we need to go back and look at the accessory uses that are listed that way in our B zones and so forth? And
was there not a similar issue with retail, like minor retail sales in, say, the lobby of a hotel? I seem to remember that was something you brought up in the past too, that right there was a, where they buy maybe snacks or toiletries or something like that, and it's seen as an accessory use in a hotel use.
I remember talking about that in regards to Trowbridge Road, but I can't remember if that was considered an accessory use or not.
Ms. Schmidt?
One of the ways that we can handle that with accessory uses, a lot of these terms we put into the definitions, and we can state these uses and their accessory uses, such as, instead of putting every possible accessory use in the accessory section. Would that clarify that, do you think?
Where would that go then?
In the definitions, like we have a definition of hotel that's linked to section, or section 50-5 or something like that. But most of the definitions, most of the uses in here have definitions.
But when you say definitions, you mean in the end of the document, or you?
Yes, remember we added a bunch of definitions of, for instance, instead of saying professional office, listing all the types of different offices, we put professional office in the definition. We put, this includes medical, architectural, blah, 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 all the different types of offices that would be able to be used, and then including their accessory uses, such as some of the typical accessory uses that you would see, like a gym for employees, or things that are normal in the different types of uses. Would that help, instead of listing accessory uses of each type of like office or retail use? Will that help?
Maybe, I'm not sure. I'm used to the way it is in the current code, so I have to think about it a little. Would it fit at all under the next section, 803, development and performance standards? You know, that's not quite what that section is for, but I'm seeing that in there we do break things down for hotel and retail sales. And
yeah, we can look at that, definitely. That would be another option.
I'm not sure if that's right or not.
It seems to me that anything you can do to not add anything else to the table would, I think, would be beneficial. I could just see that the list of accessory uses getting so long that you know, potential, I don't know that there's that many remaining, but that if they're indeed accessory uses, one would think that that would be a minor use in that area. Mr. Haywood?
Yeah, the term incidental and customary comes to mind. We can play around with that, see what we can come up with. I do want to, just a quick point of order about our agenda. I think on our agenda, we were supposed to only review parts 5 and 6.
Agreed.
So just, I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves procedurally.
Sure.
Since we noticed that we were doing 5 and 6. We can amend this, I suppose, but if we want to keep going.
Well, I think you make a good point that that if anybody, let me see if there's any, but there's nobody in attendance that's not a participant, that's not a panelist. But I think you're right. If somebody had some concern about uses that they'd wanted to discuss now, and they wanted to discuss it at a work session or a public meeting, now would be the time. And if we pass by that, there certainly will be other opportunities to comment on it. But I think you make a fair point, at least in terms of the uses, where I don't know that anybody was going to take any exception to us talking about parking and loading standards. But as we start to get into a slightly more sticky issue of uses and where they might be appropriate or not, wouldn't be a bad idea to slow things up. I'm not seeing anybody really all that eager to discuss it either. It's worth a look. It's worth a good look, actually, just to sort of, you can see where uses might be appropriate and might not be appropriate. Commissioner Sullivan?
Yeah, just because it was already brought up. I was looking at the definition of like hospital that's on here. At first, I thought that was not nearly broad enough, but when you go to the definition of hospital at the end of the document, it includes just about everything I would have included there, except for maybe a dentist office. I couldn't tell if that would meet the definition.
Yeah, I think that based on some comments that you had made in an earlier meeting, the difference between, and I won't get them all right, but the difference between, I think you were sort of the expert on child care center, daycare center.
Assisted living facilities.
There it is. That was adult.
Yeah,
adult
it's
day. Yeah.
it doesn't mean anything. It's not a legal term, so I think you'd need to call it a home for the aged or an adult foster care facility, or just use a catch-all.
Sure. I know that we referenced your comments repeatedly. All right, if there's no desire to proceed with the use table and move on to section 8, then the next item on our agenda is communications from citizens, and I'll check it doesn't look like there are any attendees that are not panelists, and so I won't take the time to read my script regarding public comment, and we'll move us on to item 4, commissioner concerns. Commissioner Wolf.
I wanted to point out that the city of Lansing is making some moves towards their own form-based code. The city council there had it on their agenda last Monday and discussed it a little bit, and then referred it to their planning board, and they will be taking it up. I don't know exactly when, but so they are proceeding. Perhaps it'll be interesting to see what they do with it. Their code is hundreds of pages long. I remember 300 or 400 pages, maybe. I'm not sure.
That's right.
It's immense.
Yep. There was an article about it in the City Pulse this week, I believe. It's something about can't have emus in the city. That
right.
I would have sworn that was an acronym when I read it. I searched to fit. Does he really mean emus? He actually indeed meant emus. Any other commissioner? Thank you, Commissioner Wolf. Any other commissioner concerns? Ms. Schmidt, I was hoping to have a sidebar, but maybe not. This should be our last official meeting of the year, and I believe that if Commissioner Kusler, who's now departed us, am I recalling his memo? All right, so apparently Commissioner Kusler is not going to be. He's not asking to be reappointed next year. Yeah,
That's correct.
so unfortunately we can't say goodbye to him because it looked like he was with his child. And then apparently that's the reason that he'd said that it's taking up, as you might imagine, it's taking up a fair amount of time to be a dad. And so he's not going to be re-upping in January. So we will have at least one vacancy in January. So keep that in mind for those of you that are out looking for new, we'll have a vacancy, and we'll notice that and make sure everybody's made aware that we're looking to fill the ranks. And maybe take a moment, if you would, and drop Jeff a note and wish him well. Any other concerns? I'm seeing none, so a motion to adjourn would be in order.
So moved. Cahill.
Thank you, been moved by Commissioner Cahill. Thank you.
Sullivan second.
And seconded by Commissioner Sullivan. I think that was written, that my script was written before we realized that we'd all be able to see one another. Moved by Commissioner Cahill, seconded by Commissioner Sullivan to adjourn the meeting. Let's have a voice vote. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion passes. We are adjourned at 8:15. Be safe, everyone. Enjoy your holidays, and we will see you in the new year. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Holidays.
Yeah, same day with you, everyone.